So just talking about BIC and your experiences, obviously you've already referred to your extensive HR career. So how does the BIC Corporate Foundation differ from some of the other organisations you've worked for, such as like M&M and Mars and the Encore Capital Group?
Well, I think my role now at the foundation is to run the foundation along with Alicia, right? So I haven't been in this position in my other organizations, but what I will say is that all the organizations I've worked for have been values driven, and they have all had a component of giving back to the community. So I'm not really answering the question by talking about difference. I'm really saying more what's the same. It's just a question of scale. Encore Capital Group was a fairly small collections debt receivable organization, but doing that work in a very ethical, values-driven way, had built out fabulous facilities in India, and at the same time invested back in the local community, doing volunteering and giving donations locally. Similarly, if you look at Mars, which is a fabulous organization to target for any of you who are interested in a multinational or a global career, they are very mission driven and they're very values driven. So while the scale of the impact might be different, or the focus might be different versus the BIC Foundation, because we're very focused on education, what is the same is that these organizations are coming to the work on the basis of their values, and they're coming to the work with this idea that organizations today can't be successful if they are just focused on making money for shareholders. There needs to be a broader mission, and thankfully what you're seeing now is that many organizations are doing that. So as you guys are thinking about where you might target and who you might target for your future careers, I would strongly encourage you to go online, do your research, look at the values of the organizations, and look at how they do their community support work. How much do they encourage volunteering with their team members? Do they have a foundation? Even small startup organizations can have a point of view with respect to how they speak up in doing good over and above making their products or making money, and giving money back to their shareholders.
Amazing, thank you. And you mentioned working in India, so I just wondered how your experiences of working in the HR industry have differed depending on the locality that you've worked in, such as New Delhi or Shanghai.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of a funny thing, when you pitch up and land in a new country, it can be pretty shocking. But it can also be quite familiar, because at some level, people are people, which maybe comes back to the psychology aspect of the HR work. What I would say is the first thing to do is to figure out what are the cultural norms. And what I've found in my career is it's helpful to have frameworks, almost like scaffolding, to be able to hang your knowledge on. And so I was very fortunate early in my career to work for Mars, that is a company that has a very, very robust training program. And ultimately, I ended up getting into HR by doing some training. But one of the most formative programs for me was a program called Multicultural Management. And it was taking the work of Fons Trompenaars, who is an expert in the field of how do people work across cultures, and how do you do that work effectively? And so he has some great research that talks about things like individualism versus collectivism, or things like how do people view time? Is it stretchable like an elastic band, or is it definitive? Is it constrained? And so what I found working in those different cultures was thinking about that framework and thinking about the behaviors of the people that I'm working with in the context of that framework. Was helpful as I was thinking about, well, how am I going to get work done? Is work going to be done differently here, or how do I influence to get work done differently? And then at the end of the day, the first 90 days in any job, any organization, is all about listening. It's all about just asking more questions and speaking less, and just really thinking about the answers that you're hearing. But what I will also say, as a tangential point to that, and I'm very biased on this point, so bear with me, maybe it's because of all the different places I've lived and worked, I really do think that if you can get an international experience outside of your home country, um, if you can get that early on in your career, it's going to really serve you well, because it will prove on your CV that you have the ability to jump into new contexts, to jump into new places, and to be agile and to be able to adapt. So think about how you might, want to do that early in your career. And even during, I don't know what years you guys are at in terms of university, but I mean, I traveled every single summer break when I was in college. So my first year, I got a job in France. My second year, I got a job in the US. My third year, I went back to France. So, think about those opportunities to travel if you have an intention of having an international career and moving across countries.
Well, thank you. You mentioned listening to the experts, and I know on your LinkedIn profile it says that you are an expert in organizational transformation. So my question really is, how do you use that in your current role?
Yeah. Well, first of all, LinkedIn's really interesting. So my caveat to LinkedIn is, we all now have to market and promote ourselves and put all of these words in order to catch, the eye of the people that we're trying to catch the eye of. So I have to say, it sits a bit weird with me that I put the word expert on my LinkedIn profile, despite the fact that I have got 33 plus years of business experience. And despite the fact that I have done a massive amount of work in organizational transformation. But at the end of the day, one of the things that you guys will need to do is to figure out what your brand is, what your online brand is, what your offline brand is. So being a little bit audacious and being a little bold and putting where your expertise is something that you can always do. And the other way I get comfortable about that is I'm always more expert than somebody else. And there's always somebody else who's more expert than me. So it's just a relative thing, right? So organizational transformation is a huge topic. To explain about organizational transformation, I need to explain a little bit about HR, and there are various disciplines in HR. One of the disciplines of HR is around organizational development, which basically means looking at the organization as a system and deciding, in order to achieve certain strategies, what are the capabilities that you need to build in order to deliver on your strategies, and then doing a gap analysis. And what OD practitioners do is they look very purposefully at the organization as a system, and then they decide, well, what is it that we need to do in order to solve for the gaps, meaning build capabilities. And those capabilities can be, what people do we need to find? It can be, what processes do we need to implement? It can be, what technologies do we need to bring forward? And the convergence of people, process, and technology is what creates transformation in an organization. So it's a very short question to a very sort of long and deep subject. But what I would say is, if you have an inkling, or if you have an interest to get towards being an organizational transformation expert, and I say expert with inverted commas, then seek out organizations that are in transformation. So don't seek out organizations that are, maintenance mode. Seek out organizations that are either in high growth, or even organizations that are in trouble and that are in the midst of a transformation. And the chances are that you will, by definition, wherever you're working, you will find yourself transforming something. And therefore, from there, you will start to have these project experiences, which then will allow you to build a kind of an expertise around it. And then the other thing I would say that I've done, which is a little bit, not surprising, but maybe it's a little bit different than my peers. I went back in 2016. BIC very generously supported me to go back to get a certificate in organization development. So this was a 2-year program of 6 modules where I was in training with other organization development practitioners for basically 4 or 5 days a week. So a significant practitioner program, which took my practical surface level understanding of OD and took it kind of a little bit higher and up to the next level. And I would say that's one of the most formative experiences of my career from a training perspective. So the bottom line is you're always learning and you never, ever stop learning. Every year, you guys, wherever you are, even if you think you're the expert of X, you know, the field of whatever you're doing is always moving. So you have to just be that kind of sponge and think about how you're going to supplement your learning once you're done with college and once you've launched your career.
Brilliant. I think that takes me on. I feel like you might have already answered my next question, but my final question to pose to you before we open the floor is, which has been more valuable in your career? Was it your education or your experience? Now, I know you've just said it's a lifelong process.
Yeah, it's sort of both. Okay, if I put myself in your shoes, and it was a very long time ago that I was in your shoes, but I still absolutely remember I don't even know if they call it this in the UK anymore. I remember the milk round process and interviewing with Unilever and Mars and all the rest of it, and getting offers and not getting some offers and being disappointed, but getting offers and being absolutely delighted. I think that what your education does now, so what you're doing now by getting a degree, is it gets you in the door. So it's incredibly competitive, as you well know. And so the choice of organizations that you go for when you get your degree and when you graduate is important, but it's not that important. What's important is to get some experience under your belt, and then you can always pivot to different organizations. But you definitely, I think, increasingly today need the degree. Oh, my Apple Watch is talking to me, excuse that. I would say technology is one of my learning edges. So figuring out how to turn this thing, which I just got a week ago, how to turn it off when I don't want it to be talking to me is something that I still need to learn. Yeah, so your education gets you in the door, and then your experiences are really what help you to have impact. And I've learned the most more from my experiences than certainly from my degree. The exception, however, is this practitioner program that I was mentioning earlier. It was very directly related to some of the things I was trying to do in my existing role, as the CHRO of BIC. So sometimes your training, your education, or your next level of education can be very targeted for what you're going through, at a particular time.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there's some really interesting answers. We mentioned about grouping a couple of the questions together, and I wondered if, Alison, you had a preference of which topic we started, or if we just open up the floor.
I'm happy that we just open up the floor and, let's just go with wherever the energy is of the group. So, it's funny here on Zoom, he or she who shouts the loudest sometimes gets the first the first opportunity. So go for it. This is where everybody has to quickly unmute themselves.
All right, I can talk then.
Perfect.
Philip, go.
Sorry if I interrupted you a bit, but I wanted to make sure I'm the first because I really want to know this answer for this question. I'm not sure afterwards if I'll be able to or not. So even if I come across a bit rude right now, I'm sorry, guys.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. So mainly it's my burning question is this. It's it's coming also from an actor's perspective because we're working with projects and a lot of time we need valuable people and we need, as someone else said, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. We need to bring them on board, but we don't have the money for it. But it also comes from the idea that I want to be an entrepreneur in the foreseeable future. And it's a solution that I saw that nobody necessarily gives you a certain way to do it. So maybe you can enlighten me. So to give you a context, you have a startup and you don't have a lot of process. You have a good idea though, and that idea attracts people, but is not enough to make them want to leave their job, their well-paid jobs, their cozy posts, and come alongside with you, take risks and dive in. So how can you convince those people, even though you don't have the money, to come alongside you and, in a sense, come to the lion's den or something,
Yeah. No, I think it's a really great question, and it applies. Not only does it apply to startup organizations, but it actually applies to organizations that are in transformation that might look risky.
Yeah, because exactly that too.
BIC is going through transformation right now, and so maybe we look like a risky proposition to some people. I think the first thing I would say is you have to have your pitch absolutely crystal clear. So meaning you have got to be very clear about what your mission is, what you're trying to do, and you've got to be very, very focused on, therefore, who are the types of people that you want to attract. And so it's surprising the number of things that you can see online, watch online, where it's the person who is communicating about their business proposition is so embedded with their idea that they can't actually tell a story clearly, and they can't tell it succinctly. So get your pitch super clear, get it super succinct. And Alicia's much better at this than me. You know, I'd love to spend 5 minutes on video, and she's one that will say to me, Alison, we need a 1 to 3 minute video, right? So if you can get your pitch clear, get it to 60 to 90 seconds, do some kind of wonderful, bright video, and get it out there in whatever social media platforms make sense, then that's your first kind of basic your basic marketing. And you guys are going to be way more understanding of how to do that, because you've grown up. You guys are the digital natives that have grown up with all this stuff. Then the second thing is you have to focus on your network. And I'm going to use two terms when I talk about network and netweaving. So, you know, networking in the traditional sense is, who do you know that might be able to help you? It comes from a place of you are always asking somebody else to do something. There's a fairly new, I don't want to say new because it's actually over 10 years old, but there's a concept that is adjacent to networking, which is called netweaving, which is, think of it as the pay it forward for business. And if you want to hear more about it, I was on a panel last week, so go to my LinkedIn and you'll see a thing, and you can watch the replay. The idea of netweaving is that you're creating connection and you're creating relationship with the idea of paying it forward. So you're not saying, what can you do for me? You're saying, what can I do for you? So before you even think about starting your business or doing your pitch or what have you done to create your network, but with the concept of net weaving? Because then if you go out and then subsequently have a need, then you're going to find that people will be more generous with their time because you've already done something. So, you know, you guys are in an ecosystem of Enactus. You are a massive network of people across multiple different university systems. If every single person on even this call speaks to 5 people about your your idea, that's a massive network, and you never know where the connections are going to come from. So it is certainly not easy to find the right people, and it certainly isn't, you know, if you don't have a lot of resources and money. But if you're very focused on what it is that you're looking for, and if you are very purposeful about creating your network, and not necessarily saying, will you come do this for me, but saying, let's have a conversation. How can I help you? And therefore, by definition, what sometimes comes back is, oh, and how can how can the other person will say, and how can I help you? Then there's kind of a serendipity that happens to the way that relationships are developed and come through. And I will certainly tell you that one of the mistakes that I have made in my career is I have not focused enough on relationships. So my advice to you, even though I've had a great career and, you know, had great jobs and all the rest of it, when I have been unable to get influence for an outcome that I wanted within any of my business jobs, it's usually been because I haven't focused enough on the relationship. So you'll be very focused on starting your project, but you may need to spend more time just getting to know people, getting to build relationships differently versus getting straight into the nitty-gritty of, well, what is it that you actually want to achieve? Does that help?
Yes. One more thing, just to clarify. So we're not just talking about business relationships. We're talking even about personal relationships. Absolutely. And combining the two. So
Yeah.
even though might be into business relationship, trying to get to know that person personally,
Yeah.
it could go towards a greater end and a goal.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I actually think that today, and especially for mission-driven kind of community efforts, most of the businesses that you guys are starting to propose, as I understand it, are being proposed for societal good, right? They're very mission-driven. And I think, therefore, that there used to be a more dividing line between, your professional relationships and your personal relationships. I think that's a concept that is completely outdated. I don't think that exists anymore. And I think that people are really ready to see that blend happening. Because, when we come to work, we come with our whole selves. We don't sort of leave half of our brain at the door and half of our relationships at the door. And so it's really important to think about your ecosystem of who you can talk to very, very broadly. Who are your friends? Who are the parents of your friends that might actually have a connection? And again, you guys are doing this with LinkedIn. What a fabulous mechanism that you have to do research to see who's connected to whom and who might be able to bring whatever research. It's way easier to build these connections now than it was certainly when I started many, many moons ago.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah. It was very helpful.
Yeah.
I just have, if I can go.
Totally. Go ahead.
I have a question on further education. You said that you're able to do a program on BIC's behalf, which is really amazing. Right now, I'm in the process of kind of trying to decide what I want to do for a master's. But one of the questions that was asked to me is obviously what I want to do and how I'm deciding that, and if I would like to go. Can you guys hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, the waves are crashing, so I feel like it's a little loud. But one of the things that I was asked is if I would prefer to go into a work environment and then make a really calculated decision based on my experiences from that. So I was wondering, would you suggest going into a master's right after university, or do you more suggest going into a work environment to develop yourself a little bit more first?
So I don't have a master's. I just have an undergraduate degree, and then I actually had every intention of working for 2 years, paying off some of my debt, and then I was going to take a year out and travel the world and then come back into the world of work. And that gap year, never happened because I got sucked into work and I had too much fun and then just carried on. I do think that unless you are very, very clear about what you're passionate about, I do think it is a good idea to do your undergraduate and then take a role, if you can find one, to have some experiences and then do your master's. Mostly because I think it's very, very difficult sitting in your shoes. It's very hard to know what jobs are out there, what are the topics that you're really interested in, and are you going to be an HR person, are you going to be an IT person, are you going to be a manufacturing person? I mean, my career, I started in sales, I moved into procurement, I moved into manufacturing operations, and then I became a trainer on an internal training program, which then got me more deeply into HR and communications and change management and transformation. I had no clue when I left university what half of the jobs, probably what 80% of the jobs were that would possibly be available to me. And so if you're in the privileged position of knowing what you really want to do, then I think fine, go ahead and do your master's and that'll help. But if you really are not sure, or if you've got 5 or 6 different things that you're thinking, oh, or maybe this, or maybe that, or maybe the other, then having some work experience, I think is really helpful. And then, yes, I do think it is a good idea to go back and get a master's, because I do think, again, depending on what your aspiration is and depending on the size of organization you want to work for, I do think that having a second degree on top of your undergraduate degree is helpful. But at the end of the day, what matters, the higher up you go in an organization and the sort of the further away from your education you go, what really matters is what have you done in the last 2 years. So it's like I said, education will get you in the door. but you have to be able to build that credible career path in order to have that credibility. Does that help?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to cut in. I really sorry, Kala, but I just had to jump in. I have two questions. Is that okay if I ask two questions?
As long as they're related. There you go. That's the as long as they're related.
Well, the reason I was asking those two questions is kind of because they're kind of been dealing with two separate issues, but I suppose I could prioritize one. The more important one to me, I'd say, is, you know, you've had your hand in HR. I mean, you're the strategic HR advisor for BIC, so I assume that you have had some experience with hiring people. So I just wanted to ask, I mean, having worked in all these different sorts of organizations, what is it? Is there like a common characteristic? Is there a common set of traits that you see in employees that really gets them to success in all these different organizations? Or does it really vary from organization to organization?
I think it varies from organization to organization. So the first thing that is very important when you're hiring somebody into any organization is this concept of are they going to fit the culture? And at the same time, you also want to kind of say, are they going to fit the culture, but are they going to bring diversity into the conversation, right? So there's a danger of saying, are they going to fit the culture? And then everybody sounds the same, looks the same, expresses the same things, and you don't end up with any innovation in your organization, right? So it's kind of like, are they going to fit, but are they also weird enough to be able to bring new thinking into the organization? So when I interview people and I ask them about their background and their technical stuff and all the rest of it, let's assume somebody's got the technical skills that are needed or the subject matter expertise that's needed to do the job. I will very often ask them about the last two places that they've worked, and I will ask them, what did they love and what did they hate about the last two places? And usually what comes up is people will talk about the behaviors of other people or the things that got in the way of them being effective. And so by kind of asking them what they loved or hated or what they would have wished they could have changed, you can then do a comparison with, well, how is it in this organization I'm working in right now? And is that person going to have, difficulty or frustrations, et cetera, et cetera. So this concept of cultural fit is important, but you also don't want to just say, oh, that person is a little bit on the fringe of what our culture is, because you want to bring the diversity in and you want to bring the new thinking and the diverse thoughts. I think the other thing I would say is the more you can talk to the individual about what they are looking for and what they expect the job to be versus saying what you need, then obviously you're going to make sure that there's the right fit. There are many organizations, and BIC has one too. That have competency models. So, a competency is just a description of the knowledge, the skills, and the attributes that you might need in order to be able to do a job. And most organizations split their competencies between what they would call the core competencies and the functional competencies. A functional competency is what do you need to be good at in a particular function. So to be an IT developer, you need to be able to code in XYZ coding skill, for example. Versus the core competency is what are the things you need to be able to do irrespective of which part of the organization you're working in. So most organizations will have a set of core competencies, and then when they're interviewing for people, they will ask specific questions against those core competencies in order to see, is there a fit? And different positions are going to ask for different things. Strategic agility, drive for results, engages others, develops others. I mean, all of these different types of competencies are going to be very different depending on the organization and depending on the position. So I guess what I'm saying, Rakin, is it comes back to what are you really looking for, and then having very precise questions around that. Does that answer your question?
Right. So a candidate should basically know what they're kind of trying to get out of the job as well. Is that what you're
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And additionally, it should also be kind of distinct enough that they would be able to contribute something unique to the organization, but not so distinct that they would kind of conflict with the values and culture of the organization.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool, thank you.
And then if we have time, we'll come back to your second question. Thank you for jumping in, and thank you for asking whether you could ask too.
Yeah, cheers.
I want to give everybody a chance.
Does anyone else want to jump in quickly?
I will, yeah.
Oh, goodness,
Sorry.
so many people.
I'll ask you.
To Rachel, it's up to you two next. It'll be a fight for the finish. Tim, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to ask about you, about more personally you, and what was your drive when you sort of set out in your journey through business? How has it changed, and have you had to make any compromises or be flexible in any of your values or ethics along your journey?
So my drive when I was in your guys' show, doing the milk round and interviewing, the only thing I knew was that I wanted to earn decent enough money, and I wanted to not work in an office. So, and I needed a car. So I had very basic needs when I was leaving university. And so I got offers from a number of CPG, FMCG companies. I got offers from Mars, from Unilever, and from United Biscuits, I think it was called at the time, and a couple of others. And I went with the one that gave me the nicest car and the most amount of money. So full disclosure, I was very, very kind of materialistic at that point in my life. And I basically decided that that's what I was going to go for. What I didn't understand at the time, and what I'm immensely grateful for, is that Mars has a fabulous kind of recruitment process and a fabulous training process. And so they knew more about me having done a 3-day assessment process than I knew about myself at that point in time. And so they put me into a sales job. And then in my career at Mars, I went from, as I said earlier, from sales to procurement to manufacturing operations, and then into HR. And so I really did explore lots of different functions, but I did it because I could at Mars, and because Mars had that particular ethos, that philosophy, if you like, about developing people. So it's a good question for you to ask yourself: do you want to go into an organization that actually believes that you can build general management capabilities by moving people around functions, which Mars does? Or do you want to go into an organization that believes that, you know, you come into supply chain and you're working in manufacturing and supply chain, and that's the silo? Or you come into HR and you're working in HR, and that's the silo? It's a choice point, and I'm not saying one is, you know, better than the other, but that's something for you to think about as you're considering which organizations you might target, and as you're talking to the people. And one other point, Raki, I should have mentioned on the interviewing thing, is it's a two-way street. You know, interviewing is a two-way street. So you need to be super prepared with at least 5 questions for your interviewers. The worst thing you can do when you're interviewing is not have a question to ask at the end of the time. So really basic stuff. Coming back to the drive and then the kind of compromises, I would say the first 10 years of my career, I was just having fun exploring different things. And so that's why I ended up going from sales into procurement and so on. And it was only when I was doing a manufacturing job and I got asked to become a trainer, like a co-trainer on a training program within Mars, that I realized that this whole HR thing existed. I was completely unknowledgeable about it, had never really thought about it, but I got into human resources through training and personal development. And from there, I think I kind of found my home. So I guess what I would say is my experience is it's okay to kind of meander a little bit, you know, go and take the path less traveled, to coin a phrase. And it's okay to have different chapters, and it's increasingly so. It's okay to have different chapters throughout your career. As it comes to having to compromise, I've had to compromise sometimes on the work that I've done, meaning, you know, when you get a job, there's maybe 75% or 80% of the job that you like to do. And there's always the 20% that you really don't like to do. At least that's been my experience. Anybody who loves 100% of their job, fabulous. Hats off to you. I would love to have that job, but I've never found it. So you always have to take the rough with the smooth. So I don't know that that's compromising. I think it's recognizing the things you like to do, but also recognizing that you've got to kind of just swallow and do the things that you don't like to do. And just think of it as, oh, well, it's good for me and it's character building and it's great for my development and all of that stuff. From an ethical perspective, I have never compromised on my ethics or my values. Now, maybe that's just simply because that's how my dad and my mum brought me up. I've had to have some pretty difficult conversations with some leaders, and I've had to be quite I don't know, stern, I suppose, or quite persuasive to point out if something wasn't where I thought it should be. But I've never had to leave an organization because of an ethical situation or a values mismatch. Usually in my role, especially the higher you go in human resources, sometimes when you're dealing with an employee relations issue or an issue which becomes a legal issue, sometimes it's a question of, you know, he said, she said, she said, he said. It's not really clear the black and white of the situation. And so, you know, at the end of the day, you just really have to go with what you believe is the right thing and focus on what's right for the business overall and the individual people who are involved in the situation. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, what matters is can you come home and love, you know, and hug your loved ones? Can you look at yourself in the mirror and can you say, look, I did everything that I possibly could do to resolve the situation? And I won't compromise on my values. That's just, I won't. And I would encourage you guys to never do that either. It's not worth it. And if that means you have to leave an organization because of it, so be it. There's plenty of organizations out there. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sorry, how did those conversations go in regards to like the difficult conversations that you had with your team leaders?
Sometimes not very well, I will admit, and sometimes well, and sometimes, you know, sometimes I would feel like I was literally talking to a brick wall. I mean, I have one particular gentleman that I started working with in China, who, if he ever saw this, would probably say, yes, I totally remember the conversation. And I really felt that I was saying things and he wasn't listening and you know, didn't really feel I was having any impact at all. But funnily enough, 3 months later, in a similar situation, he showed up very differently with different behaviors. And so sometimes you don't actually know that you're having impact, which is very frustrating actually as an HR person. You know, it's quite rare that when you give difficult feedback to a leader, that they're going to say, oh, thank you so much. That was so helpful. You know, mostly you get some kind of defensive reaction, or mostly you get an argument, or mostly you know, sometimes you get the eye rolls. You know, you just have to be very clear about what is it that you're trying to put out there. And by the way, the difficult conversations are not about telling somebody what to do. They're about holding the mirror up and about framing different possibilities. So, you know, it's always about thinking about what's the purpose of your difficult conversation. So for those of you who are leading teams, because that's what you're doing as part of your projects, if you have a quote performance issue or a difficult conversation to have, make sure that you're very clear about what your purpose is. You know, gone are the days where we can all be those autocratic leaders and just tell people what to do. Nobody wants to be told what to do. Nobody ever wanted to be told what to do. But 20 years ago, when I first started in business 30 years ago, autocratic leadership was kind of a style of leadership. You could, if you had hierarchy and power, you could tell people what to do and people would actually take notice sometimes, mostly, and they would do it. But it's not a sustainable model for effective teamwork, and it's not a sustainable model for leadership. So, you know, it's always a dialogue and it's always a conversation.
Thank you.
Just with that, Alison, just had a quick question.
Yeah.
Just building on the framework, what would be a good framework to implement rather than a top-down system?
Well, I think you've got to be very precise about what leadership style you're going to bring forward, and it doesn't mean that you're going to be always co-creating everything. So I'm a person who loves frameworks and models. That's probably why I love all of this organization development stuff. But if you look up Peter Senge, he has a really simple model that's called the Collaboration Continuum. And sometimes when you're leading a team, you want to go full bore on collaboration, meaning you're co-creating, everybody has a say, everybody's voice is equal, etc. And then sometimes, if you are in an urgent situation or if maybe expertise is required, you don't want to do any collaboration and it's all about telling somebody what to do, right? So there's two extremes on the collaboration continuum. There's co-create and there's tell. And then in between, there's tell, there's sell, there's test, there's consult, and there's co-create. So what that model, if you can kind of imagine that continuum, what that model allows me to do as a leader, if I'm thinking about engaging with a team, I'm thinking very, very purposefully about, well, how am I going to show up as a leader? Am I going to create a conversation, which is a co-creation, where there isn't a hierarchy? Or do I have a point of view? Do I have a hypothesis and I'm bringing forward something and I want to test my idea and get feedback from others and then bring that feedback in and change something. So there isn't a one size fits all. There are multiple ways to show up as a leader. But the most important thing you can probably do is to be transparent about how you are going to lead. And Mina and probably Alicia, when she gets to know me a little bit more, they will be very clear with you that when I am being autocratic and telling, I am very clear that I'm telling. And when I'm creating space, and when I'm trying to create space in the team for the team to co-create, then I'm very purposeful about how the conversation is going to take place. So, and by the way, that can happen on a project at a macro level, but it can happen at an individual level in one conversation. So you're constantly needing to be thinking purposefully about how you show up as a leader. Does that make sense, George?
That was perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Rachel.
You've talked a lot about what skills we need for work and the things that we need and what you are looking for in the people that you are going to be hiring and putting into positions. I'm working with the next group of children that I need to skill up, and they're very difficult children to engage because they've been excluded for a long time and a lot of them have become very disengaged. How would you suggest working with children to actually empower them with those skills that you are going to need then in the workplace? Because there seems to be a massive gap there that we could be a bridge for. And how would you suggest building that bridge?
Yeah, wow, that's a huge question. Look, I'm going to answer it with the caveat that I am absolutely not experienced in working with children. I mean, I have 4 stepsons, and I've done a reasonably mediocre job at being a stepmom. So I'm not coming at the answer from any kind of practical expertise or experience. But I would say, if I go back to taking an OD approach to this, an organization development approach, the first step of this OD cycle, this organization development cycle that I like to talk about a lot, is this concept of diagnosis. So if you're looking at your kids and you're looking at your children and you're diagnosing them, literally you're asking the question, what's going on for them? How are they feeling? How are they showing up? And what might they need to develop in the future, and what might be a progression for them, because you can't take them from 0 to 10, for example, immediately, but what might be an appropriate progression, and then figure out what are the small, what we would call in OD terms, interventions. What are the small initiatives that you could bring forward to help them to develop their skills. Now, that would be an OD-centric approach. That would be diagnose it, figure out where you want to go, figure out the gap, do some interventions, and so on. You could take a more kind of a design thinking approach and use much more of a kind of voice of the customer, voice of expert. So I don't know whether you guys have done any work in your studies on design thinking. Maybe you have, but
I do global design masters.
Well, there you go. Exactly. So you know all of this, right? So you probably know what you need to do, which is get out there, get to your voice of the customer, but maybe your voice of the customer includes some experts as well. And so figure out how to design a very, very targeted diagnosis set of questions, which would then allow you to go back in and say, okay, well, what are the small things that that these kids need that are going to get them to progress over time? I mean, I think, Rachel, you're probably very well placed, much better placed, frankly, than I am to answer your question, because with your design thinking methodology, just trust the methodology. Trust the methodology, use your methodology to solve the problem in a way that it's not been solved before. I mean, that's the beauty of all of these innovation processes and the design thinking, you know. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is a lot of the work that is on the startup side. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. I think his name is Eric Rice. I'll double check that and I'll send you a link afterwards. But this idea of the minimum viable product, right? Have you guys talked about that in any of your studies? So it's this concept that when you do, so if you use design thinking and you're trying to get the voice of customer in and you're doing your initial prototype of a product, you know, if I was making this pen, what would my initial prototype do? It's the idea that this does not need to be 100% perfect. It just needs to be a minimum viable product that you put out there into the world, and then you get feedback and then you iterate. Now on products, like a big pen, you've got to be careful because quality really matters. But if it's a training and an education and a service that you're providing to the kids, which if I'm understanding correctly, that's what you're talking about, Rachel, then 80% is okay. And then you iterate on the solution that you've put forward, because all you need is a minimum viable product or a minimal viable solution to start getting some feedback on, and then you iterate and then you iterate and then you iterate. Does that help?
It does, and it sounds daft, but I've just been doing my methodology module, and I've literally just handed that in. So for all this time, I've been working so hard on looking at that for my design, and I hadn't turned it onto my Enactus project as a real life. And now you've said it, it's like, that's so obvious.
Yeah.
But it's taking it from the classroom and actually putting it out into something real. Yeah. Is actually a step in my head.
Yeah.
Rachel, I think it goes on from the fact that I'm sure you guys are sick to death of Claire and myself saying, what is your minimum viable person? So how can your project help that one person instead of your product? And then expanding that and scaling it up to, like somebody's mentioned, the lean startup. It's all these methods of design thinking that Alison's talking about, of like, let's help one person before we create something that might help 100, but it might also fail. So it's how we can scale up but make sure it's right for that one person first. So yeah, sorry to chip in.
No, that's great.
No, that's fine. I should go at it as a designer.
Yeah. And the other thing, Rachel, I would say is there's a book that I read, I think it's called The Innovator's Dilemma, years ago, so my memory is not the best. But one of the things that I think this guy talks about, maybe it's Clay Christensen, he talks about making sure that when you are talking to people, that in order to bring innovation into whatever it is that you're doing, whatever you're trying to solve for, don't just talk to the people who are automatically in the lane of whatever it is you're trying to solve. So for example, you know, if you're working with autistic kids, which I think was what you, if I'm remembering correctly, that's what you were talking about.
Excluded kids.
Excluded kids, sorry. Then, you know, don't just talk to the experts that are already serving them, but talk to other people that are outside of that norm. So people who are not working in a particular area can be sometimes the most interesting people to talk to about something, because they don't have any preconceived notions. They're not hanging on to anything that was, you know, that is kind of sacred. There's no sacred cows. So think about different people in your network. You know, for somebody like me, like if I have a problem, I should be thinking about, well, who are all the young people that I should be talking to about this problem? Because my friends are not young. They're like 55 years old, just like me. Well, we're all coming at something from a frame that is the old person's or the senior frame, right? Whereas it can be very helpful to actually bring the young person's frame in, or the French frame versus the US frame, or the Asian frame versus the African frame, you know? Thinking about getting different voices in, I guess, is what I'm saying as well, as you're testing. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, so I had one more question. Sorry.
Go ahead, Carlotta.
Yeah, so this is more like a two-part question. So firstly, I would like to ask if you've ever experienced the glass ceiling, and then also how rapidly are gender dynamics changing in corporate management?
So, so first of all, Alicia is asking for a group picture because she has to go pick up her son from daycare. I'm just seeing it in the chat. So yes, we will definitely do that. So the glass ceiling, you know, I used to say, I get this question quite a bit, and I used to say no. And I think the real answer is I don't know, because maybe, I mean, I've certainly worked in the last 15 years where I've been what's called a member of the C-suite, you know, so C-suite just simply means you're the CEO and you're reporting one level down, right? In the vast majority of positions that I've had, I've been the only female or one of two females in a team, which at the time that I've been in those roles, I've not really thought much about it. And I've never really thought that my gender made a difference. But I'm not sure whether that's actually true, because I don't know that I've personally experienced, you know, that glass ceiling or that bias. But at the same time, when I look around the table, you know, there are a few people that would look like me from a gender perspective. So I think the honest answer is I don't think I have knowingly come up against the glass ceiling. But then the second part to the question is, to the answer is, and I'm not sure that I was conscious enough about it to think about it. And maybe that's because I've been very fortunate that I've been able to continue to progress. What will be interesting now, as I think about what I'm going to do, in addition to being the executive director of the BIC Foundation, this is a less time-consuming job than my prior job, my CHRO job. So I will have more time in the new year to be able to think about doing things in addition to being the executive director of the BIC Foundation. And one of the things that I'm thinking of doing is deciding whether I will look for a board position, meaning a position on a board of directors. And so, you know, that's going to be very interesting because there is a lot of male dominance in boards of directors. And so maybe we need to ask this question in a year's time, Carter, and we'll come back and I'll tell you whether I've reached the glass ceiling with my desire to potentially explore the board positions. I feel like I missed the second part of the question. Did I miss it? You're on mute, hon.
The second part of the question was if there has been any changes in gender dynamics in corporate management.
So, so the answer is yes and no. First of all, certainly there's definitely been a change in terms of the focus on gender dynamics in corporate management, and most organizations now of any size have a very particular focus on diversity, and not just gender diversity, but diversity of all shapes and forms. What has also changed is that many countries are actually taking the topic of gender equality very seriously. So France, for example, BIC is a French family-controlled and French publicly traded organization. And so we are required to have a certain percentage of females on our board of directors, 40%. So the consequence of legislation change at the board level has resulted in more females being appointed to boards of directors. Here in the US and California, there was a law that was passed last year that basically said all boards need to have at least one female representative. So it's changing, yes, because of the fact that we've got some legislation changes, but it's also changing because I think that females are becoming more demanding and more braver and more, they're just assuming more opportunity. And you know, frankly, if you go back to how family dynamics play into that and how relationship plays into that, there are just different expectations. So, you know, my mum's generation, my mum is 87. When she married my dad, there was no expectation that she would have a career. When I came out and went to university, and you know, there was an expectation that I would have a career. And now, you know, with you guys, there's a whole different level of expectation. So I think it's changing. It's probably not changing fast enough. Adam, you said you had an additional question.
I have a question.
Let me just take Adam first, because he said he had a tangential question, and then we'll come to you.
Just to add on to that, it's lovely to hear the diversity that's happening, and the part of what I want to know, just to refer back to what I said at the start, as a team leader and working with different people, what I want to know, you've worked for a plethora of different diverse companies. What have you seen in the last 5 years in terms of work culture that's changed?
So I think that the focus on what we call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has massively changed. The fact that companies are starting to be more declarative on that topic and have voice. And I'll give you a very specific example. Even at BIC, you know, we have now formalized what we call an allyship program. So a program to really support diverse voices in our organization. We have signed up for the Charter of LGBTQI, Charter of Human Rights, which is a UN charter. And you guys may be aware of really it's a global movement now, but the US movement around Black Lives Matter and all of the challenges that we've had from a racial discrimination perspective in the US. We have become very, I would say, voice forward, meaning we've found our voice publicly in making statements around those rights. And so I think I read a very interesting report just yesterday, actually, that is a research report around should organizations make a stance on social issues and on political issues. And it was basically a research report that has been done. And it was showing the progression over the last 5 years. And what the report was showing is that increasingly customers, consumers, people like you, me, and everybody who buys from companies, they are expecting companies to take a stance and to have a voice. And so I think that has radically changed, and I think it's almost like it's accelerating. You know, there's been movement, and then it's in the last 2-3 years, it's been accelerating, and unfortunately, some of the reason it's been accelerating is because we've had really bad instances of bias and racism and terrible things happening in communities. So I'm very idealistic about it. I think that companies should take a stance, and I think that it's part of being a values-driven organization. And so I'm really hopeful that it will continue to evolve.
Well, I'm just very aware of the time. Do you think we can do a quick screenshot with everybody waving, and then maybe take 3 more questions? Cool. Alison, I know you are a very busy person, so obviously must have lots of things to be getting on with.
I'm just trying to make sure that I know what Mina can probably even look at my calendar and tell me what I'm supposed to be doing after this. Maybe I have the opportunity to have my lunch after this, so we can run over if you want to. So.
Okay, we'll maybe stick with 3 questions. Samir, I know you had a question. Jamie, I feel like you've had your hand up for ages. And maybe the last question is all to play for. So be ready, everybody. But in the meantime, can I do, Georgina, are you okay to, sorry, she's other side of the office.
Everybody has to get their hair sorted.
Sort your hair, everybody, get your cameras on. You are no stranger at Enactus by now, everybody, to waving and smiling and looking very ready, and then we'll get some screenshots. Okay, are we ready? I'm going to go 3, 2, 1. Got to keep going, guys. I'm being told that we've got to keep going, and we are sorted. Thank you, everybody. That's amazing. And you've done your arm workout for the day, so you don't have to go to the gym. Okay, so Samira, do you have a question for Anson?
Yes, I do. So I have 2 questions. My first question is, what are there graduate opportunities with BIC Foundation? And then the second question is, if I want to do my master's thesis on a case study of BIC Foundation, how do I go about it?
So, so the answer is, on your second question, you should contact Alicia and myself with what you are thinking you might want to do. And we are very, very open to exploring that. The first question, are there opportunities at the BIC Foundation? So we are a very small foundation with a very small team. So it's basically Alicia and me. And so we don't have formal opportunities for full-time positions. But one of the things that we'll be thinking about next year is the question of internship. We have a small amount of budget, and it's just a kernel of a thought of an idea that's in my head right now. So if anybody is interested in doing an internship, which would be basically, it would depend on the studies that you are doing and the time and so on and so forth that you would have. You know, we do support interns at BIC. Well, I should say pre-COVID, we did a lot of interns at BIC. So in the US, we would do interns during the summer. In France, for example, we would do interns as people were doing their masters, you know, coming in and working part-time. So we have put a little bit of a hold on that because of COVID, due to the challenge of being able to appropriately orient and drive the work. That being said, now that we have spent 9 months essentially learning how to do all of this remote work, I personally don't think that that is an issue any longer. I think that we're all perfectly capable of managing work remotely in a targeted way. So even if we are not back to normal and we're not all vaccinated, and you guys are in the UK, so you're going to be vaccinated probably way quicker than us here in the US. But even if we're not all back to normal in terms of physical, then essentially, I think there's a way of probably figuring out a way to do project work remotely. So yeah, just reach out and we'll have a conversation. Okay.
Well, Jamie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So I would like to touch on the role of technology in HR, and more specifically, I would like to talk of the rising influence of artificial intelligence in HR processes. Do you consider it has any limitations right now? And do you think its development will impact the HR field, creating major changes in the future?
So I definitely think it will impact the processes and the practices in the future, but I think it's going to take a lot longer than we all might think. So certainly the artificial intelligence work that can take rote work away from processes. So, you know, that can be in hiring, in screening resumes, etc. The most advanced organizations are obviously already using that. And that means that some of the entry-level jobs and some of the more rote jobs are definitely going to change and ultimately go away. That being said, HR technology is complex and expensive. And I'll tell you a little story briefly. I started talking about investing in an HR system at BIC 3 months after I joined. So that would be June of 2014. And I advocated for investment for 6.5 years. And we actually signed a contract to invest in an HR system at BIC on the last day of my tenure at the CHRO. So I'm telling you this story to show you that we're a 15,000 person organization that didn't make a decision to invest in HR technology until pretty late in the game. And so there's lots of ways to do the work without spending money. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing per se, and I'm not saying it's a good thing per se. I'm saying it's a choice. And so I think that the HR technology space is still going to be quite expensive. And so the adoption of some of these AI programs it's definitely going to happen, but it will happen in the bigger organizations and more advanced organizations quicker than maybe some of the smaller organizations. But it's definitely going to be here to stay. The piece that is the hardest, and funnily enough, my husband actually has a master's from Stanford in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So he and I talk about this all the time. And he says the piece that's going to be the hardest is this judgment piece. You know, when you're interviewing, when I'm interviewing with you, I'm making a judgment. I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm making a judgment based on what you're saying. The judgment piece is going to be the hardest because the algorithms will take a very long time to be able to catch up to our beautiful human brain.
Well, does anybody else have a question? I know you all have them.
Yes, I do.
Ooh, Philip, okay, I'll let you off, but you have already answered one, so
I also have a question to pose. Have we got time?
Okay.
Let's go to Elliot, because Philip has already had his 10 minutes of fame or his 5 minutes. Go ahead, Elliot.
What I wanted to ask is, how do you empower your team members to excel in their roles and produce a really strong collaboration between disciplines and departments?
So Mina should answer this question because she's had to work with me for the last 6 years. So I will tell you how I try to, on my good days, what my intent is, and then sometimes it doesn't actually work. The most important thing is really being clear about the vision of what we're trying to do and getting very clear about the goals, and then just getting out of the way. Now, in reality, that sometimes works and that sometimes doesn't work. And so we kind of go back to a little bit of what we were talking about before with the leadership models. You guys might be aware of the situational leadership model, which talks about when do you delegate, when do you really work more directly with somebody versus when do you coach, etc. So I try and get very clear with each of the individual team members what their preference is, what they want, and then I just try and get out of the way. So and then sometimes my over controlling aspect comes in, and I don't do that very well, and I end up inserting myself, and then usually I have to remember to just stop and get out of the way and let people do what they need to do.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, Alison, do you think you've got time for a final question? Or
Sure, go ahead. Why not?
Yeah, Philip, it might be your time.
Thank you very much. Made me very, very happy. It's a rather quick question anyway. So it's mainly about, the question is something like this: who is your hero? But by this, I don't necessarily mean a character or a person. It can be maybe a trait or something. In a sense, I'm looking for, what are you looking up to? So you're a very accomplished person. You have worked in a lot of environments. But I suppose the question is, are you looking up to anything now?
Yeah, I'm constantly looking up to anything, to lots of things. Look, generally speaking, in any system, and I'm talking about system in the broader sense, any organization, any community, any group of people, any team, the people that I look up to the most are the people that speak truth to power. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. And so there are people that do that all the time. There are people that do that choicefully. There are people that do that artfully. And when I hear it and when I see it and when I experience it, I think that it is a great kind of leveler. So I think that in organizations today, We need to create very, very open spaces and very, very open dialogues and discussions. And we need all of the voices in the room. You know, if we think about today, those of you who spoke up quickly, maybe you're the extroverted ones in the room. One of the questions that I would leave you with is, what could we or what should we have done differently to bring into this conversation questions from the more introverted that are in the room, right? And so it's a small example of how do we make sure that all the voices come into the room, and therefore those people that are prepared to speak truth to power in any ecosystem, in any team, in any project group, are the ones that are probably going to bring new thinking into the organization, and that new thinking is going to bring innovation, and that innovation is going to bring growth and sustainable development, and you know, create great opportunity. So yeah, I'll leave you with that. Thank you for a great question.
Real. Thank you so much for your time, Alison. I'm sure we could go late into our evening or maybe into your lunchtime with these questions, but it's been so enlightening for me and amazing to hear. And I'm sure the Enactus students are going to take this away and take it back to your teams. I think, guys, it's such an amazing opportunity. And now that we've recorded it, if anyone would like a copy, or if you're thinking of any team member that would love to see this, please let me know, and we can send it via WeTransfer, and a bit of like Christmas watching, I'm sure. So brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alison, and enjoy the rest of your evenings, everybody. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, guys. Really great questions. I really enjoyed it. If I can do anything to help, I shall expect to hear from you all on LinkedIn, those of you who have not yet sent a connection. And I wish you all the best. If I can do anything to help you in your career search, just let me know. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye bye.
And thank you to the team leaders. Thank you for organising this team leaders with me. I really appreciate it. All right, see you later.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.